Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. How much real power do international rules have when they clash with global military strategy? Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description.
Yeah, it's a question that really forces us to look past the usual diplomatic rhetoric, to examine what happens when push actually comes to shove on the global map.
Precisely. And to answer it, we are analyzing the situation surrounding the Chagos Archipelago. For those who, might not be intimately familiar with the geography, Chagos is a remote cluster of islands situated right in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Right in the middle.
Exactly. But its history is, well, it's as dark as it is complex. Back in 1965, the United Kingdom formally separated this archipelago from Mauritius. Now, Mauritius was a British colony on the verge of its independence at the time. This separation formed a new entity called the British Indian Ocean Territory, or the BIOT.
And what followed that separation is what makes this case so stark. Between 1968 and 1973, the UK and the US carried out the forcible expulsion of the entire indigenous Chagosian population.
Thousands of people.
Right, we're talking about thousands of people removed from their homeland. And the reason? To clear the way for a highly strategic, completely sanitized United States military base on the archipelago's largest island, Diego Garcia.
Which brings us to the modern collision. Fast forward to 2019, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ in The Hague, ruled that the UK's administration of these islands is entirely illegal.
A massive ruling.
Oh, absolutely. They declared it a blatant violation of decolonization principles, and then the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly backed that up, demanding the UK return the territory to Mauritius. Yet the military base remains fully operational.
Yeah.
And the UK remains in administrative control. So this is the central tension we are exploring today, the clash between hard geopolitical military strategy and international law. My position, looking at the evidence from our material, is that Chagos proves a harsh reality. In the realm of global security, hard military power, physical control, and strategic imperatives ultimately override international law and decolonization norms.
I come at it from a different way. I argue that the mounting legal and diplomatic pressure surrounding Chagos demonstrates that hard power is unsustainable without legal legitimacy. International law forces even superpowers to eventually alter their strategic footprint. The UK's position is actively eroding right now because of its legal vulnerabilities on the global stage.
Let's unpack the reality of that strategic footprint first. Because if you're listening to this and wondering why a tiny island matters so much to a superpower, you have to understand the mechanics of Diego Garcia.
Sure.
When we look at the source material, it becomes immediately apparent that Chagos is not some forgotten, dusty colonial relic. It is an absolutely critical, irreplaceable military puzzle piece for the United States' global operational system.
Well, irreplaceable is a strong word.
But accurate. Think about the sheer logistical utility of the base. It became operational in 1971, right in the thick of the Cold War. If you look at an atlas, Diego Garcia might seem like a speck, but militarily, it is an unsinkable aircraft carrier parked dead center in the Indian Ocean.
The staging capabilities are massive, yeah.
Massive. We are talking about a massive 2-mile-long runway capable of launching B-2 stealth bombers and B-52s directly into the Middle East or the South China Sea. And they do that without needing permission to fly over Allied airspace.
Right, they just bypass local airspace restrictions entirely.
Exactly. It has a deep-water naval lagoon that holds pre-positioned squadron ships. These ships are constantly loaded with enough tanks, ammunition, and fuel to supply an entire Marine Expeditionary Brigade for a month.
Wow.
You simply cannot replicate that kind of secure, isolated logistics hub anywhere else. It was indispensable for operations in the Gulf War, crucial for Afghanistan and Iraq, and remains a vital hub for ongoing Indo-Pacific surveillance today.
Yeah, the utility is undeniable.
So my point is this. The UK and the US have maintained the status quo, despite a definitive 2019 ICJ ruling and overwhelming UN demands. Why? Because physical control over key maritime and energy routes simply supersedes diplomatic pressure. A court ruling in The Hague does not stop a bomber from taking off.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the medium to long-term strategic costs of ignoring that court ruling? You point out the runway and the deep water port, but you can't separate the physical concrete from the legal foundation it sits on.
And you think that foundation is crumbling?
It is actively cracking, yes. You mentioned the 2019 ICJ determination. What the court explicitly stated was that the 1965 separation was an illegal violation of decolonization principles.
True, but as we both know, the ICJ lacks an enforcement mechanism.
Hold on, because that assumes enforcement only looks like a military blockade.
Well,
The ICJ and the UN General Assembly resolutions cannot send a fleet to evict the British and the Americans. I concede that. However, what they have successfully done is strip the United Kingdom of its global narrative.
explain that a bit more.
Well, for decades, the UK and the US framed their occupation of Diego Garcia strictly in terms of international security. They sold it to the world as a necessary shield. But the ICJ ruling fundamentally replaced that British framing with a Mauritian framing of decolonization. The Global South no longer looks at Chagos and sees a security shield. They see an illegal colonial holdover.
But does that narrative shift actually degrade military readiness? I mean, does it matter?
It absolutely creates genuine strategic costs. It's about diplomatic capital. The fact that we are currently seeing medium-term negotiations between the UK and Mauritius over sovereignty proves my point. If hard power was the only variable, as you suggest, the UK wouldn't be at the negotiating table at all.
That's a fair observation.
Right? They just ignore Mauritius completely. They are negotiating because ignoring international law indefinitely is politically and diplomatically untenable, even for London.
Well, to understand why that legal pressure exists today and why the UK is willing to absorb so much diplomatic heat to keep the base, we really have to look back at the causal link. We have to look at the original justification for creating the BIOT in the first place.
Yeah.
Because you don't just erase a population without a massive strategic incentive.
And the methods they used to erase that population were extraordinary. I mean, they literally shut down the local copra plantations to starve the local economy.
Right.
They prevented Chagosians who had traveled for medical care from returning home and eventually just forced the remaining population onto cargo ships.
It is a dark chapter, undoubtedly. But in the context of the era, it was a brutally standard exercise of Cold War realpolitik. The West perceived an existential Soviet threat in the Indian Ocean. They needed a secure, completely controlled node for intelligence and military operations.
Even so,
And crucially, they wanted it without the complication of a local population that might eventually demand independence or, worse, align with the Soviet bloc. It is essentially comparing international law to a speed limit that the military simply outruns when national security is on the line.
I have to push back on that analogy.
Okay, why?
Because separating the territory just before Mauritian independence in 1968 was a fatal legal error. They didn't just break a speed limit, they violated the UN's decolonization framework.
But they secured the asset. The base was built.
Yes, but by doing so, they planted a time bomb that is now detonating on the world stage. They violated the principle that colonial territories must be granted independence as a whole. You cannot dismember a colony before letting it go. That is the legal flaw mobilizing the entire UN General Assembly against them today.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. This historical flaw naturally brings us to the modern reckoning, this clash between the UN and the UK-US alliance. And what we actually see here is the limit of the rules-based order.
How so?
Because look at the outcome. It shows the severe limitations of international institutions when confronted by entrenched military power. The UK maintains effective administrative control, the US maintains operational military control.
But the institutions are calling out the violation.
Calling out is not the same as compelling behavior. Yes, the Mauritian government has overwhelming international backing, but international bodies have limited coercive capacity against major military powers. The base's projection of power just trumps UN votes.
you are equating enforcement entirely with military coercion. And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the rules-based order functions.
Then how does it function?
It isn't about forming an international army to punish rule breakers. It's about the maintenance of alliances and the currency of legitimacy. Think about the international backing Mauritius has gained. Flouting the ICJ actively undermines the UK and US's ability to enforce rules-based norms in the Indo-Pacific against other rival nations.
So you're saying it hurts their broader regional strategy?
Exactly. How can Washington rally countries like India or the Philippines to challenge excessive maritime claims in the South China Sea when Beijing can just point to Chagos and say, you only respect international courts when it suits you?
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Because examining the UK's defense of its overseas territories inevitably invites a comparison to its most famous territorial dispute.
Oh, the Malvinas. I knew we would get here.
We have to. The Malvinas, or the Falkland Islands. When you analyze the two situations side by side, you see a remarkably consistent British strategy of holding strategic maritime assets regardless of international controversy.
I think the similarities are superficial.
Not at all. In both cases, you have British control of disputed territory, high strategic military value, UN intervention, and massive decolonization debates. I think this shows a consistent strategy. The legal arguments might shift, but the underlying principle is the primacy of territorial control.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Why not? The parallels are incredibly revealing.
Because the comparison to the Malvinas actually destroys the UK's legal defense rather than supporting it. Think about the fundamental difference. In the Malvinas, the UK relies heavily on the legal argument of self-determination for a stable, existing population.
Right, the democratic will of the islanders. They held a referendum.
Exactly. Now, look at Chagos. In order to build their pristine military fortress, the UK actively and forcibly expelled the entire indigenous population.
Right. You cannot use the self-determination defense in Chagos when you literally loaded the people onto cargo ships and exiled them. By removing the Chagosians, the UK completely neutralized their own standard defense. This makes the Chagos case infinitely more unfavorable for the UK in juridical terms.
Well, both cases certainly reveal the contradictions of empire. But to summarize my position, despite the legal bankruptcy you just described, the empirical reality remains unchanged. The uninterrupted operation of Diego Garcia proves that physical control and strategic utility outweigh international courts. The planes still fly.
And to summarize mine, the UK's legal hypocrisy, especially compared to the Malvinas, and the ongoing sovereignty negotiations demonstrate that geopolitical power eventually has to answer to international law. Hard power is unsustainable without legitimacy. Though we disagree on the primacy of power versus law, I think we both see a likely long-term future scenario here, a hybrid model.
Yes, where the strict binary is broken down. It seems highly probable that sovereignty is eventually transferred to Mauritius.
Right, which complies with the UN.
Exactly.
And this is the crucial caveat, that transfer will almost certainly be maintained through a massive, long-term lease agreement for the military base itself, maybe a 99-year lease. It represents a compromise between international law and military strategy.
It really does. It allows Mauritius to fulfill its post-colonial destiny, while the Western Alliance secures its vital node in the Indian Ocean without the lingering stain of an illegal occupation.
It forces us to look much closer at the map. I'd encourage everyone listening to look deeper into how these historical colonial legacies intersect with modern military infrastructure across the globe. Because, maps often hide the complex realities of displaced populations and the hidden architecture of global security.
We reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs. See you next